This series of lectures will be called Launching the New Nation. It'll focus on the time period of 1789 to 1812, the administrations of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. Really, how this nation became established and stabilized after the founding of the Constitution. This particular lecture will focus on George Washington's administration, 1789 to 1796. One of the first tasks tackled by the new government was the judicial system. With the Judiciary Act of 1789, it provided for a Supreme Court with a Chief Justice and 5 associate judges. The Constitution only stated that there would be a judicial branch. It didn't state what it would look like. So Washington's administration took on the Judiciary Act of 1789. It also set up 3 federal circuit courts. Think about each region of the nation, so north, middle, and south. And then 13 federal district courts, which of course would be each state would have a federal district court. It also allows state court decisions to be appealed to the federal court when constitutional issues are raised. Remember, the Supreme Court and federal courts only handle issues of constitutionality. So in other words, a state issue like a marriage law or an education law would not be handled by the federal Supreme Court. It has to be something that brings into question an amendment or the Constitution itself. The next thing that they did was created a cabinet. In 1789, the executive branch only had 2 officials, president and vice president. So Congress created 3 executive departments to help these leaders govern. The Department of State to deal with foreign affairs, and the first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. The Department of War to handle military matters, and the first Secretary of War was Henry Knox, and the Department of Treasury to manage finances. The first Secretary of Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. Today, the cabinet is much larger. You have the Department of Education, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Homeland Security, and of course, our Department of War is now the Department of Defense. But back then, in 1789, there of course wasn't all of those things needed. The federal government has added cabinet positions as both the nation has grown as well as the government itself. Hamilton's first task was to handle the national debt. Now, when Hamilton takes over, each state had their own debts, but he believed that part of the role of the federal government would be to assume all of the state debts and take them under the title of the federal debt. And that's why he gets the nickname the father of the national debt. He believed national debt was a blessing because it means that people would be invested in seeing this nation survive because they wouldn't want to take that debt back on. So Hamilton's plan shaped fiscal policies to the trickle-down system. He believed that if taxes and fiscal policies, financial policies, favored wealthier groups, the wealthier groups would support the government. And this means that the government would become stable and wealthier. By also favoring wealthier groups, they would become wealthier. When they became wealthier and the government became stable, then this would lead to prosperity. One of the things you have to think about is the fact that when there's stability both in the government as well as prosperity in the economy, people have money, which means they spend money. When they spend money, people have jobs to make the things that people spend money on, which means that the more money there is in the economy, the more likely it is that the average person will be able to make money. And so this will then trickle down to the masses. The first objective was to bolster the national credit. Congress would fund the national debt and assume state debts. States with large debts, like the northern states, like Massachusetts, loved this plan. States with the small debts, like the southern states, hated this plan. He had to also explain how it would be paid off. Tariff laws, which are taxes on imports, would be passed. A protective tariff is a tax on imports that are also produced in the United States. So if you have a protective tariff, this means that you are making the good being imported into the United States more expensive than the American-made good. So not only do you get the money off the taxes, but you also benefit American industry. At this point, industry is mostly in the north. And then if you look back here, who are the states with the large debts who love this? The northern states. So not only are they having their large debt funded, but then also you have a protective tariff which will protect them. The other thing you have was a whiskey tax. This is an excise or a luxury tax. A luxury tax is a tax on something you don't need, but you might want. If you don't need it, it's only taxed for those people who are willing to pay it. For example, today we have a tax on cigarettes. Not something you need, but something you might want. And people who want cigarettes are willing to pay a higher price, a higher tax for those goods. It was a tax on the product's manufacture, sale, or distribution. The third thing wasn't necessarily how to pay it off, but rather how to fund it, and that's a national bank, a place to hold the nation's assets, so for example, all of these taxes that were being collected, as well as land grants, because one of the things this nation was we were land rich, but money poor. You guys should remember that from the different land ordinances that existed under the Articles. So how do we collect the money from the sale of that property? And then also to take that money from the tariffs and the taxes and pay off the loans, pay off the debts that we owe to other countries. Individuals could invest in the bank as well. Because this is controlled by the federal government, it would be more stable than independently owned banks. Realize the banks that we have today are all independently owned. They're owned by a company or an individual or a group of people. Either way, the people that invest in them trust that the bank will exist. Well, up until the 1930s, banks were dependent on whether or not people were willing to invest in them and how much money that banks lent out to other people. It's only after the Great Depression that the federal government will insure banks, creating a lot more stability in banking than existed prior. So the National Bank, or the Bank of the United States, would actually have a huge benefit because it would be funded by the federal government, so it would be the most stable bank in America. But it'd also be the tightest in terms of credit, so you might have trouble getting a loan from the Bank of the United States, but it would be a good place to invest. So as we talked about before, the North, which were the commercial and financial centers, loved this, whereas the South, which was agriculture, did not like it. So how do we get a compromise to get Hamilton's plan approved and to get a national bank? We also have a debate between Jefferson and Hamilton at this point. Jefferson argued against the Bank of the United States. He said that it wasn't constitutional. The 10th Amendment said that anything not specifically listed in the Constitution is reserved to the states. He's what we call a strict constructionist. He read the Constitution and interpreted it exactly as it was written. Hamilton, on the other hand, was for the Bank of the United States. He cited something called the Elastic Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause. See, the Constitution has the Necessary and Proper Clause that says the federal government can create anything that is necessary and proper for the nation. He's a loose constructionist. He reads and interprets the Constitution loosely. So the compromise is the District of Columbia. Large debt states, or northern states, got to give away their debt to the federal government. And southern states, who often had the smaller debts, they got the capital. So the capital was originally supposed to be in what is now Alexandria. However, that land was considered too swampy to build the nation's capital on. And if you look at some of the flooding that goes on there, it kind of makes sense. So instead, they moved it across the Potomac River into a portion of Maryland. Keep in mind that Maryland is a southern state, so though geographically D.C. looks like it's the middle of the eastern seaboard, it is firmly cemented in southern territory. So instead of the District of Columbia or the nation's capital being in, say, New York or Philadelphia or Boston, it was put in southern territory, and that's where the compromise came. So remember that excise tax that would be a luxury tax on whiskey? Well, because of that, we have the Whiskey Rebellion. American Western farmers were mad at the tax. Whiskey was used as currency on the frontier. They often bartered, right? Instead of using gold coins or paper products, they used products that went into making currency. They were also living in a territory and didn't have a say in the federal government, so they felt that this was taxation without representation. People in western Pennsylvania or areas of Kentucky and Tennessee that were producing the whiskey didn't necessarily have representation yet. So in western Pennsylvania, 1,200 men led an armed rebellion against the government. Unlike Shays' rebellion, Washington led the militia from many different states, and the rebellion scattered. This is very, very important. First off, we're talking about a militia from many different states. Remember, with Shays' rebellion, it was only the Massachusetts militia that went in to stop the rebellion. It wasn't a federal initiative. The other thing is that this shows the power of this new federal government. Washington said, no, 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 you don't like this? Get the right to vote, vote these people out of office. You can't do it by rebellion. And so if you look at our history, we won't have another major rebellion led by individuals until the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is huge, but the fact that we were able to go from 1790 to 1860 without a major rebellion like this one means that the federal government really showed its power and the power of the executive branch to sort of enforce laws and control it. And also the fact that Washington really created that sort of precedent that will be followed for a number of years. During this time, because of the debate over the bank and the national debt, we have the development of political parties. Now, Washington opposed political parties. He really felt that it would become too divisive. But in Congress, over debates over what laws should be passed and over big issues, we see the development of a two-party system. So we have Federalists, which were Hamilton's party. They believed in a strong central government and northern industry. Then we have Democrat Republicans, which were Jefferson's party. They believed in power to the states and small independent farmers. They believed that they were the People's Party. See, Hamilton believed that the government should be somewhat separate from the people, whereas Jefferson thought the government should be more responsive to the people. Hamilton felt that the majority of power should reside in the federal government because it moves a little bit slower, whereas Jefferson believed that power should reside mostly in the state governments because it could be more responsive to the people's needs and be able to move faster. Remember, during the American Revolution, the French decided to support us in our independence. And in 1778, they signed the Franco-American alliance with us. We promised support if they came into a time of need. Well, in 1789, they started a revolution. And we started having discussions about whether or not we were going to support them. Washington was very concerned about us getting involved in supporting the French Revolution because 1789, we've just established ourselves as a nation. We just ratified the Constitution. We haven't even figured out the national debt or anything like that. So how can we fund a war to support another nation? Well, then in 1793, the Reign of Terror begins. And when people started getting their heads cut off in the middle of streets of France, there was a serious concern about whether or not this was the right revolution to support. It caused heated debate in America. Democrat Republicans were pro-French. They really felt that we should get involved. Federalists wanted to back the British against the French. So Washington's decision was he knew that any war or battle could destroy the new nation, and so he kept a middle ground. And with the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793, he said we weren't going to get involved. We were going to remain neutral in these foreign wars. However, not all French believed that we should stay out. Citizen Genet was an individual from France who came over to try, a diplomat from France, who decided to come over to try to gain support for his country. Instead of meeting with George Washington, the President of the United States, he went directly to the pro-French South to recruit support. Well, this goes against diplomatic protocol. Diplomats can't meet with individual states. They're supposed to meet with the leaders of the country. Okay, and so this is where you see that balance of power. Who's supreme, the federal government or the state governments? And Washington is very firm that the federal government is supreme, and that diplomats, foreign diplomats, should be negotiating directly with the federal government and not with individual states. This is another precedent that is set that shows the power of the federal government. So Genet is removed from power, and we don't end up supporting the French. Now, the British were still occupying the frontier forts on the Ohio River Valley. They were supposed to be abandoning these forts as part of the Treaty of Paris, 1783. They were giving weapons to the Indians to fight American settlers. For example, General Mad Anthony Wayne led a victory over the Miami Confederacy in 1794. This was in the Ohio River Valley. But in winning this victory, it was also discovered that the Indians were holding British weapons, and so there was this concern. So Jay was sent to Britain to try to negotiate a new treaty with them. The concessions he got was that they would abandon their frontier posts, which is exactly what they agreed to in 1783. And they also said they would cease impressments of sailors and ships. You see, the British were coming up to our American ships, capturing them, and forcing our sailors to serve in the British Navy by saying, you were born as a British citizen, so you're now going to serve in the British Navy. So in other words, they weren't recognizing our American independence, or the fact that this technically our sailors were not part of their country. Pinckney's treaty in 17 Jay's treaty, by the way, it was very, very unpopular, because we felt that we didn't get anything extra from the British. Matter of fact, though they said they would cease imprisonment, they weren't going to pay us back for the ships that they already stole. And so Jay is actually going to get he's going to lose a lot of popularity in the United States because of this. Pinckney's treaty, on the other hand, was incredibly popular. It was an alliance with Spain, and it gave to the United States use of Florida and the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. So now all of our farmers, both in Kentucky as well as Tennessee, could now use the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans to get their goods to market, so the nation can continue to expand and grow. By 1796, Washington had decided to retire. He believed in limited terms. He didn't want to be king. He didn't want to be president for life. He didn't believe in that. He believed that there should be a rotation of power, that new people should come in and take over power, and that they should create a balance. Plus, he was tired. So, in 1796, as he leaves office, he makes his farewell address. He makes there were two big things he pushed in there. One, he warns against making alliances with foreign nations. And so with that, we aren't going to make any alliances with foreign nations until really the creation of NATO in 1946 after World War II. We'll get involved in foreign wars, but we won't make any concrete alliances. Okay, he's also going to warn against political parties. It was really too late for those, but if you look at some of the divisiveness that comes up throughout American history, the Civil War, the Progressive Era, things like that, it kind of makes sense why political parties at times might create more upheaval in America than actually solving problems. Washington set a lot of precedents in his administration, 2 terms in office, which is something most presidents will follow until FDR in the 1930s. We won't make alliances with foreign nations until 1946. We see the power of the executive branch as well as the power of the federal government being established over state governments. We also decide that we will remain neutral in European wars, and that'll extend all the way up until really World War I. All of these precedents were really important for the first president of the United States to really establish, so that this nation could get itself underneath in a firm foothold and really start to establish itself as a country and not just a colony. The next lecture will focus on our second president of the United States, John Adams.